I am glad to come here today and speak about the public access laws in Indiana. Basically, the Public Access Counselor was an office created to help agencies deal with public records requests and how to make sure that their meetings are open to the public. And so basically, we are kind of like a referee. We take calls from public agencies when they have issues. You know, do I have to give this record out, or when do I have to post this notice for a meeting? And I also take, calls from the public, basically, when, they call and say, hey, they denied me this record, what should I do now? Or, hey, I wanted to go to this meeting. And so basically, we're on nobody's side. We're just basically want to make sure that the laws are followed. And so, and that's what one of the main duties of the office is, to go out and educate not only the public, but public agencies to, ensure that the open door law, which governs the meetings of a governing body, and the Access to Public Records Act is, complied with the way the General Assembly, set it up. And so it's interesting, actually, a little bit the history about the office. It was created in 1998. The actual public access laws, the open door law, and the Access to Public Records Act have been around since the 70s. But prior to the Public Access Counselor being here, your only real avenue to file a complaint or, to think that, let's say the clerk's office is violating the law was you had to just go and file a lawsuit. And for many people, the expense and the time and all those other considerations to go along with that is just, it was so cost prohibitive that, a lot of the times there was no real sense that the agencies of Indiana were really doing what was required of the law. And so to kind of buttress this, Governor O'Bannon, in '98, he was approached by a group of newspapers, and they said, we did this informal survey where we sent these reporters out undercover to go to these various different offices, both state and local and county, and just to make basic records requests. We're talking about minutes, we're talking about different things like that. And in one small county, not only was the person denied the request for no valid reason, he was escorted out of the county by the sheriff. And so when Governor Bannon heard that, he thought, well, there should be somebody where the citizens and the agencies can go for assistance in regards to these laws, because they come up so often. And so that's how we came about. And so we were created in '98 by Governor O'Bannon. The next year, the General Assembly thought that that was a good idea. And so they said, we're going to codify this into law. And so since then, we've been around to assist everybody in regards to the Open Door Law and the Access to Public Records Act. We have basically three main duties. I touched on one before. We come out here and do presentations, answer questions in regards to the Open Door Law and the Access to Public Records Act. We respond to just general informal inquiries at our office. That can be something as simple as, you calling us up and say, hey, what do I do here? Or getting an email or a letter from an inmate, or just different things like that. And then also we have what's called formal complaints. And that's where somebody's like, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried and I can't get this record from them and I don't think they're following the law. I want to file a complaint with you. And in that instance, we would receive the formal complaint. We would give you an opportunity to respond if you were the agency that had the complaint filed against you. And then we would issue a non-binding advisory opinion. Basically, did the clerk's office comply with the law? Did the Indiana Gaming Commission comply with the law? And that's what our role is and how we've been established since 1998. Now, it's interesting that, and I just shared this story before we got started, is one of the little hidden secrets of the Public Records Act and the Open Door Law is that the state of Indiana and their agencies, whether they're state, county, and local, are doing an excellent job of complying with the laws. And like I said, you're never going to see a newspaper article where it says, Marion County Clerk's Office complies with Open Door Law. Congratulations. It's always going to be Marion County Clerk's Office keeps records from the public, in defiance of the law. And so if you look at just in statistics-wise, last year we received 350 formal complaints filed against agencies in the state, whether that's as big as the governor's office all the way down to the Vanderburgh County Sanitation Department. And so from those 350 complaints, you have to think from an initial standpoint, the Open Door Law and the Access to Public Records Act applies to every public agency in the state. And so think of every single public meeting that occurred for every agency over the course of the last year. And think of every single public records request that was submitted to an agency. And that's a number that I know that reaches into the tens of thousands. And from that tens of thousands of requests and all of those meetings, we had 350 formal complaints, and from those complaints, we found there was 87 violations. So a third of the complaints that are filed. So last year, we found there was 87 violations out of a possible of tens of thousands of numbers. And so you guys are doing an excellent job. And one of the big things is people always think that there's some evil intent on behalf of you out there when you're denying a request or you're making sure you're complying with the open door law. They think that the reason why there are violations is because of some hidden agenda, where in actuality, the number one reason why there is a violation found is just either the agency wasn't aware that the law existed in relation to that specific area, or maybe they misinterpreted it, or sometimes they just make mistakes, just common, honest mistakes. And, really, like I said, I think the agencies are doing an excellent job. And if you even break those numbers down further, of the 350 formal complaints that were filed, 10% were withdrawn before we even issued an opinion. Basically, either the agency said, wait, we should have given these records, and so the person comes back and says, hey, I got what I wanted. I don't need you to, I think they've completely complied. And also, a third of all the complaints filed, and I would say half of our time we spend is in relation to inmate requests or inmate complaints. And so I don't know if that was when they established the Open Door Law and the Access to Public Records Act, I don't think that was exactly the motive or the intent of it. But like I tell people, we treat those complaints and questions with the same amount of respect as we do any complaint. But of all the inmate complaints filed, we had 111 last year. I would say probably 107 of those, we said that there was no violation, that the agency was completely acting in compliance with the law. And so, again, just goes to show that you guys are actually doing an excellent job at your job and, in complying with the Public Records Act and the Open Door Law. Now, what I'm going to try to do today is just go over a couple things. I'm going to go over the Open Door Law briefly and the Access to Public Records Act, and I'm just going to point out the most common reason a complaint is filed in our office and, the best way and the proper way to deal with that if it comes up in your office. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation that was just passed in 2012 in regards to now that there is an opportunity for a person to be fined by a judge if the judge would find that you completely ignored the requirements of the law in responding to a request. And then we'll have an opportunity to take questions and, just give it basically anything you have, inquiries in regards to both laws, feel free to ask. So the Open Door Law. The Open Door Law basically says that all meetings of governing bodies must be open to the public for the opportunity to observe and record. Sounds fairly basic. The number one reason that we see a complaint filed is because the agency fails to provide proper notice to that meeting. Now, if we're just talking about a normal, everyday, basically if your town council meets at the first Thursday of every month, well, you need to post notice 48 hours prior to that meeting, and you have to give the time, date, and location of when that meeting occurred. And so here would be a proper notice for any meeting of the town council here in the town of Xavier. You see the time, date, and location, and the street and exactly where everything's taken place. Now, like I said, 48 hours prior to the meeting, that needs to be posted. That needs to be posted either at the door of the agency that's holding the meeting, or if the agency doesn't have an actual physical office, that needs to be posted at the door of where the meeting will take place. Now, what we've also said before is that, for example, in some counties, there's like a posting board that they keep in the courthouse or in City Hall, and that's where all the notices are posted. We've also said, if that's more than fine to post your notices there. And so basically, one of the common calls we'll get is that there are some meetings that you're required to post notice in the newspapers, things that have to do with passing an ordinance and budgets and different things like that. But your normal, everyday, your normal meetings, I guess for lack of a better term, there's no requirement pursuant to the Open Door Law that you post those in the newspaper. Now, the Open Door Law is a baseline. It's basically what you have to do. And I know many of you out there know of agencies that take that extra step and post the notice in the newspaper because you've always done it and people rely on that. And we applaud that and we think that's great. But if somebody were to file a formal complaint with our office and say, hey, they had this meeting and they didn't post notice in the newspaper, well, generally there is no requirement that you do. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. Now here, one thing that comes up from time to time, and I was kind of surprised when I first came into the office, it's sometimes people that are filing the complaints really don't care whether you violated the law or not. Their really intent is maybe perhaps to embarrass you, perhaps it's a political situation, perhaps somebody lost an election, or maybe they just don't agree with the decision that the council made at that last meeting. And so here's an example. a town council had a meeting and they passed an ordinance. I don't remember the exact details of what the ordinance was, and there was a gentleman there who was very upset that they passed that ordinance. And so he was trying to think of ways to get the ordinance overturned. And so he looked at their notice and he said, well, I look at this notice and I have no idea where that meeting's supposed to be at. And so he filed a complaint, and the agency issued a response, and they said, you know, I'll just call him Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson had been coming to the meetings of that town council for the last 20 years, and he knew exactly where that was at. And they said, we acknowledge that we did not put the exact location of where the meeting was at. We apologize to Mr. Johnson, and from this time forward, we will provide the actual street address and room number on our notices. What I said is, I had to say that in that situation, that the council did violate the open door law, but as now they recognize that, the requirements of the law, and if they do that going forward, they made a mistake here, but I don't have the power to overturn, something that council did. Now, a judge would be able to, but generally what our office would say is if there is a violation, for example, here, if there is a violation of the notice, what an agency can do is just go back and redo the meeting, basically. It seems kind of a little bit ridiculous, but if they go back and then the next week they post the notice with the exact location and then they redo the meeting, well, then they've complied with the law, and there's nothing more that a judge would be able to do, because a judge, if somebody would file a lawsuit about the open door law, they're not going to get $50,000 in personal damages for anything like that. The remedies of the court would be to perhaps overturn what the council has done, but they're not going to be able to receive any kind of like monetary damages, and sometimes people aren't aware of that once they start going down the road of trying to file a formal complaint or file a complaint with our office or for a judge. And so just remember, time, date, and location, 48 hours prior to the meeting. That doesn't include weekends or holidays, and you won't have any issues. Now, the second big area as far as the open door law where we see problems is executive sessions. Now, executive sessions are those meetings where the public is not invited in. And basically, there are 14 reasons why an agency could have an executive session, and most of those are found under this subsection here under 6.1b. Now, if you look under those reasons and you can't find, and you wanted to talk about, let's say, for example, I got a call yesterday, and a school board had met, and they wanted to meet an executive session regarding a suspension of a student. Now, what the executive session says is that a governing body can meet to discuss the alleged misconduct of an employee, or they can meet regarding an employee evaluation or different things like that. But nowhere in the open door law does it say that a school board can meet regarding a student's suspension. So we had to say, you're more than welcome to have that meeting in an open public meeting, but you're not going to be allowed to discuss that in an executive session where all the doors are closed. And so that was just a common example we get. Well, people will call, agencies will call and say, hey, this is what we want to discuss. Can we meet about that in executive session? And we'll tell you based on, what we read in the statute, whether or not it'd be something that would apply. And so going back to executive sessions, those are meetings, obviously, that you have to, you can close the doors on. There's a number of requirements there that you have to follow, because basically the General Assembly said, agencies, we know there's going to be situations where you're going to want to meet with, behind closed doors. And if you are going to do that, you need to follow these specific instructions, or you're going to be found in violation of the law. One of those first ones would be is that there has to be a memoranda or minutes. Minutes are referred to as memoranda in the open door law. You have to keep memoranda of that meeting. Now, you basically have to tell me who was there, you have to tell me what you discussed, and basically you could just refer to the actual statute where we met under Indiana Code 514, 1.5, 6.1b9 to discuss the alleged misconduct of an employee. That would be what you'd have to provide. Now, at the end of those minutes, you would have to issue a statement stating that the only thing that we talked about was in relation to that Indiana citation code. And so that's one of the first steps they say is, if you're going to meet an executive session, you need this affirmative statement there saying that that's all you discussed. Now, a big no-no that comes up in executive sessions is you're never going to be allowed to vote in an executive session. All votes have to be taken at an open public meeting. The open door law refers to voting as final action, and so basically we say all final action must be done at an open public meeting. You can never vote in an executive session. So I'll jump forward just a second here. You have to provide notice for executive sessions the same way you'd have to provide notice of any regular meeting. And so basically 48 hours, you have to have that up, time, date, and location. But for executive sessions, you have to have two extra things. Number one, you have to provide the statute that allows you to meet in executive session. So here, you see that 6.1B9 is the statute that says that a council can meet in an executive session to discuss a job performance evaluation of an individual employee. You don't have to put the actual individual employee's name that you're doing the job performance evaluation of, or you wouldn't have to put the employee's name that you're talking about the alleged misconduct of. You just would need to put that statute and the language of that statute. And the reason why they say you have to put the language is that if you come up to a notice, just a common everyday person comes up to the notice, or 99% of the people in this country come up to this notice, they have no idea what 514, 1.5, 6.1B9 means. And so what our office has said is you need to go the extra mile and provide the actual language of that citation, just so to offer a more sense of transparency to the people that are reviewing the notice. One of the most common things we find in violations for executive session notice is there will be no citation, there will be no language of the citation, they'll just put personnel and litigation to be discussed. Now, it is possible you are going to be allowed to talk about things related to litigation, and it is possible you might be able to talk about certain personnel matters, but it's just not a blanket exception. And so you would need to actually put the statute and the language of the statute and make sure that those are the only things that you're discussing. And so to go back here, here's a couple, like I've referred to a couple times already, there are a number of personnel things, alleged misconduct of an employee. If you're receiving information and interviewing employees for a prospective job, you can do that in executive session. You can talk about a job performance evaluation. But if you just wanted to have an executive session to have a general discussion about the deputy clerk in your office, you're not going to be able to do that. Again, you have to fit it into one of those categories, and if it doesn't fit, well then you can't talk about it in an executive session. You're more than free to talk about it in an open public meeting, you just can't do it in an executive session. And so, for example, here's some of the things. A common thing that'll come up regarding like alleged misconduct, or when you're hiring an employee, like if it requires a vote of the agency to hire or fire an employee, well then you can meet in an executive session and interview prospective employees and talk about them. But then when you actually, if your agency or your county requires a vote of the council to like hire an employee as the new superintendent or the new, whatever it would be, that vote would have to occur at the open meeting. In the same way for alleged misconduct, if you thought that one of your clerks was stealing from the auditor's office, you could meet in an executive session, the governing body could, and talk about the alleged misconduct, perhaps receive some statements from people saying, well, I saw Betty take the money out of the drawer, or, different things like that. But if the decision was, the decision actually to terminate Betty would have to occur at an open public meeting. And so that's something you want to keep in mind. Just no voting at an executive session is the big thing. So these are the kind of general, this is going back, this would be the proper notice of what would be required of an agency who's having a meeting in an executive session. Now, as far as teleconferencing and video conferencing, it won't really be applicable to local and county agencies, but a recent legislative change has said that state agencies, if they want to enable their members of their governing body to meet telephonically or to meet via Skype at their meetings, well, then they're allowed to do that come January 1st of 2015 if they pass a policy that says, we are going to allow our members to meet and vote via either telephonic, like, via a conference call, or via, Skype, set like if you had a television up there that had the person, appearing from home. And so it really won't apply. It only is going to be applicable to state agencies. What the law does say as far as county and local agencies, if there's a specific state statute that allows you to meet telephonically or allows you to meet via Skype at your meetings, then you're allowed to do that. At this point, I'm not aware of any state statute that would allow you to do that. So basically, this won't really apply to state and counties as far as, the ability to meet teleconferencing and video conferencing. The reason why they passed this law, I believe, is like, for example, I used to work at the Indiana Gaming Commission. We would have a meeting 4 times a year, and our members of the Gaming Commission hailed from basically all around the state, basically from every community that had a casino in their county. And so you would have people coming from Gary, and you'd have people coming from, as far down as Evansville, and those people, they, A, you'd have to pay them to travel to the meeting, and then B, it'd be their entire day. And so what they said is, if it's a cost-effective measure, and you feel that, you're still able to conduct your meetings proficiently with the person appearing telephonically or, via Skype or some video arrangement like that, then go ahead and do that. It just makes good sense. It's basically Indiana catching up on the technology curve. And so any state is always behind in that measure. And so this is basically what it would mean for, state agencies. A common question we get a lot is electronic mail considered a meeting? So for example, let's say I was on a town council of 5 members and I emailed a proposal that I received to the other 4 members on the council and said, hey guys, what do you think about this? Now, this is a gray area as far as what the law is concerned, because there hasn't been any Court of Appeals or Supreme Court cases dealing specifically with this measure. What our office has said, without having that assistance from either the General Assembly or the courts, is we've said this is a gray area, but generally our answer would be is that no, email is not considered a meeting. One of the first things that we're going to look at is that if you are intentionally trying to get around the requirements of the open door law by sending off these rapid-fire emails, going back and forth and deliberating and discussing, it's probably more likely than not you're at the bad end of that gray area, and so that would probably be considered a meeting. But in my original example, if I sent out a proposal, said, hey guys, this is a proposal we received, and I sent it out all to the other 4 members of the board, and they just received it, printed it out, and looked at it for themselves, and then came back at the next meeting and you guys talked about it there, well, that's not going to be considered a meeting. So I guess if you were going to treat your email as a board member as like an instant messaging type thing where you're just going back and forth, where I send out my email at noon to everybody, and then at 12:01, the vice president responds, and at 12:03, the secretary responds, and then 12:07, and that's going to be the type of situation where we're going to it kind of looks here that you're trying to get around the law, by not meeting officially and posting notice, but by doing it technically privately via email. And so that is the general, direction you're going to get from our office. One thing to keep in mind, emails are most likely going to be public records that you might have to produce in response to a request. And so you might somewhat be allegedly skirting the open door law here, but your emails might be subject to disclosure in another area. And so just try not to be too tricky, I guess, is the point, and keep that in mind. Memoranda requirements. Basically, one of the things that Debbie wanted me to talk specifically about, and you guys asked about, is what is required in your memoranda for your meetings. And basically, here are the requirements set out in 1.54B, and basically these 4 items, starting with the date, time, and location, are what is required. You have to note the date, time, and location of the meeting. You have to note who was there and who was absent. If there's a vote taken, you have to know who voted for what, whether it was, 4-0, everybody voted yay, or, 3-2, and, these 3 people voted yay and these 2 people voted nay. And then the last part is basically a throw-in, basically not a throw-in, but you have to provide the general substance of all matters proposed, discussed, or decided. Now, no 2 sets of minutes are ever going to look alike. I know of agencies that they've sent me their minutes, and it's 5 pages of minutes for a 45-minute meeting, and I've seen other meetings or other memoranda notes of the same type of meeting, which would only be 1 page. Basically, as long as you're providing the information that's required in the law, you're fine. Some agencies like to provide this more explicit detail where they'll list like every single person that spoke regarding the ordinance for the construction of a bridge, and they'll put every member of the public that was in attendance, or general things like that. But as long as you're providing the general substance, which basically what I interpret to be is like a summary of what was talked about, discussed, or decided, then you're doing just fine. Oddly enough, we don't get a lot of formal complaints regarding the memorandum minutes, but if we do, oddly, it's a person will complain, they'll write a complaint, and they'll say, I got up and spoke at that meeting, and it wasn't noted in the memoranda. And so what we'll say is, as long as they provided the general substance of what is discussed, there is no requirement that they specifically note that, Jane Doe spoke regarding the ordinance of the bridge. And so, it's one of the odd things. It's not necessarily that they disagreed with they just wanted to be noted themselves that they spoke out at the meeting. And so we'd say there is no requirement as long as they're providing a general substance. So if they just put the town next discussed the construction of the bridge and ended with a vote, and at that time the city voted 5-0 to construct the bridge, that's generally all that would be allowed to do. Another thing about minutes, which is odd when I found out, is that draft minutes are considered public record. And so typically what I know is that the agency will have a meeting, and then the secretary or the clerk in whatever instance will create the note for the minutes of that meeting. And those minutes aren't technically officially the minutes of the agency until they're approved at the next meeting. But let's say you get a public records request between those meetings for those draft minutes. Well, there is nothing that says you've already created the record. It doesn't matter whether it's official or not. Once you create the minutes, they become a public record. So let's say my council meets on the 1st and 3rd Monday of each month, and we have a meeting on the 1st of May on a Monday, and on that Tuesday, the clerk generates the minutes. She goes back to her office the next day and types out all the minutes. Well, 3 days later, she gets a public request for those draft minutes. Those are a record pursuant to the Access to Public Records Act, and you'd have to provide those. But let's say, for example, we had that meeting on the 1st, and the clerk didn't actually create the minutes until the Friday before the next meeting. Well, if there is no minutes created, you don't have to, you're not required to create them in response to a request. And so basically, it's once the minutes are created, they become a public record, and you'd have to disclose them. You couldn't say, we're not going to give those out because they're only in draft form. So kind of odd, but that's something also that you want to keep in mind if you are at a meeting or if you're responsible for keeping the minutes at a meeting. Last few things before we move on to the Access to Public Records Act. There is no requirement that the public be allowed to speak at a meeting of a governing body. There are a few exceptions to this, and mostly that has to do with budgetary concerns, or perhaps some local counties and local agencies have passed ordinance that says at the end of every public meeting, we are going to allow public comment for 15 minutes. But minus those two exceptions, your normal everyday meeting, there is no requirement that you allow the public to speak. Now, when the public will file complaints about this, we'll say, there is no requirement, so they didn't violate the open door law by not allowing you to speak. But I'll remind them that, usually the people that are members of the governing body are going to have to get reelected at some point, or they're going to have to be reappointed. And if you're just going to ignore your constituency, more likely than not, you're probably not going to vote for that board member going forward at the next election. So that's how we try to, try to appease what they're talking about. What I do know is that many agencies are letting the public speak, and they have a set of non-discriminatory uniform policies set up. So basically they'll say, we'll let anybody talk on anything on the agenda for 3 minutes. Or they'll say, we'll let anybody talk, but you have to provide your contact information, because if you do raise a point that the council thinks we should address, we want to be able to get back in contact with you and work with you on this issue. And so as long as it's uniform, you're more than fine. There was a complaint a while ago, like in 2003, where the agency was allowing people to speak in favor of the ordinance, but not against the ordinance. We said there, obviously, although it didn't technically violate the letter of the law, because there is no requirement to speak, we did say, obviously, the sense of democracy and liberty and general things of that nature. If you're going to let one side speak, it's probably pretty practical and common sense to let anybody the opportunity to speak. To go along with that, there is no requirement that an agency would deliberate prior to taking a vote, and so people become upset because they'll say, well, we elected these public officials, or these public officials were appointed to that board, they didn't talk about the ordinance prior to passing it. They just said, all in favor, yes, all opposed, yes. We don't know what they're thinking, and what we'll say is there is no requirement that they deliberate. The open door law doesn't say that it has to be deliberated. But what I will warn agencies about is that if you're having meetings and everything is crystal clear and everything is cut and dry and it's boom, 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 well then people are going to start to think, where are they talking about these things if they're not talking about it at an open meeting? And if they're not talking about it in an open meeting, in the executive session list, there's nothing in there that would allow them to meet privately, I think they're meeting in private and talking about it, which would be illegal. And so you're just going to cause yourself more headaches in the long run. So while I will say there is no requirement that you do deliberate, sometimes it might be beneficial just, for the appearance, because what people often say is the appearance of impropriety is worse than the impropriety in itself. And so if they believe that you're out, doing things behind closed doors, and one of the ways to, I guess, counteract that would be to have more deliberation at your meetings. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. There is no requirement that you have an agenda at a meeting of a governing body. If you do have an agenda, you have to post it at the door prior to the start of the meeting. So if today was going to be considered an open meeting, if I had an agenda, I would be required to post it at the door prior to the event. Just because you have an agenda doesn't mean you can change your mind does not mean you can't change your mind during the meeting and say, well, hey, let's talk about that issue regarding the bridge. Or, you're not stuck with the agenda once it's created. Basically what the law says, if you're going to use one, you need to post it at the door so people will know. I know agencies that provide copies at the door for people, and that's great. We applaud that. Again, that's above and beyond the requirements. As long as you are posting that notice at the door, then you're doing what the law says you're required to do. The last thing, 2 things. You have to make sure the open door law applies to governing bodies of a public agency. And so, for example, let's say the mayor's attorney wanted to meet with the auditor and the clerk and the attorney from the sanitation department. If those 4 people don't make up a governing body, which typically I'm assuming that they don't, well, then they don't have to have that meeting open to the public. And so we'll get complaints sometimes. We'll say, I know that the mayor met with his attorney regarding this ordinance that was coming up. You know, I think we should be allowed into that meeting. Well, and we'll say, well, if the mayor and his attorney is a governing body, well, then they would have to be, you know, that meeting would have to be open. But minus, if they are not a governing body, well, then you wouldn't have to, that meeting wouldn't have to be open to the public. And so basically commissions, boards, commissioners, things of that nature, those kind of meetings are going to have to be open to the public. But members of various different governing bodies that meet are generally, those meetings are not going to be not going to be required to be open to the public. And just the last thing is about the definition of a meeting and what the open door law says is a meeting. Some people will think, well, we didn't vote or we didn't really do anything, so it wasn't a meeting, so we didn't have to post notice or anything. And what the law says is that a meeting is the gathering of a majority of a governing body of a public agency for the purpose of taking official action on public business. So for example, if I have 5 commissioners and 2 of us get together to talk about passing of the ordinance for the bridge next week, that's not a meeting because there's 2 of us, and there's 5 members on the actual council. That's not a majority of the council. Now, if the other factor there is we have to be taking official action. Now, official action just doesn't necessarily mean voting. It could be something as little as receiving information, deliberating, establishing policy, things like that. And so let's say that on my 5 commissioner board, 3 of us wanted to get together and have breakfast tomorrow morning and talk about that same ordinance. Well, there we have a majority. We're going to deliberate regarding the ordinance, and that ordinance is something that our commission has power over. And so in that situation, that, you know, quote-unquote meeting at the breakfast joint would be considered a meeting, and you would be required to post notice of it. Seems kind of obscure, but, you know, you have to keep in mind what the open door law says a meeting is, not just what the general perception, you know, that the common sense would say what a meeting would be. So you just want to keep that in mind. Just because you're not voting or quote-unquote doing anything important does not mean maybe that you're not having a meeting. And so keep that in mind. Going back to my first example, there is a prohibition against serial meetings. And so let's say in my situation, let's say I had 7 council members and we wanted to be tricky. And so we were going to get 3 of us together on Monday. We don't have to post notice for that. And then a separate 3 of us, we're going to get together Wednesday and we're going to talk about it. So we're going to get everything worked out and we're not going to violate the open door law and we're going to be able to go to that meeting and just vote. Well, there's a prohibition against something called serial meetings, and that exactly is what that would be. And so just don't try to get tricky or outthink the law. Basically, just use good common sense is what agencies are doing in Indiana already. And so in regards to both the open door law and the Access to Public Records Act. So we'll move forward now to the Access to Public Records Act. What I always tell people is that our office only deals with these 2 laws, and I would say 1/3 of our time is the open door law, is dedicated to the open door law, and the other 2/3 is the Access to Public Records Act. The reason for that being, there are more records requests made throughout the year for records as opposed to meetings being held. The open door law, the breadth of the law is compared to the Access to Public Records Act is very brief. And then there's just more nooks and crannies, what I call them, in the Access to Public Records Act that, you know, lead to typical problems that do come up. And so we'll talk a little bit here about the Access to Public Records Act and what are the big things that typically come up, you know, where agencies get in trouble. And as an initial instance, though, what basically the Access to Public Records Act says is that records of the government should be available to their citizens minus any applicable exceptions. And so in a dream world, we'll call it, if someone comes in and asks you for a copy of a record, you either need to provide them with that record or you need to cite to them the specific statutory code that says either this record is confidential or this record is a discretionary record. I have discretion whether to give that out or not, and I'm not going to do that at this time. And so that is technically, you know, the way it's supposed to appear. And so as far as response times, one of the first things we'll get into, and one of the common areas that we find that people get confused as far as response times. Now, when I say response times, I'm not talking about the time period that you're required to actually provide the record. I'm talking about the time period that you're basically required to acknowledge the record. And so if I go into the clerk's office and I say, I'd like a copy of last month's meeting minutes, within 24 hours, they're supposed to orally acknowledge that they received my request, and if they provide the record, great, but if not, they're not required to. And so common sense would be, I come into the clerk's office, I want a copy of the minutes from last night's meeting, or last month's meeting. She says, I have to go get those, I'll mail them to you tomorrow. That would be all that's required. If you make an oral request, you have to make you're only required to make an oral response. And you have 24 hours to do that. So there's not going to be many times where somebody makes an oral request where we find that they didn't orally acknowledge it. I guess the situation would have to be, I'd like a copy of the minutes from last month's meeting, and the person would just stare at you in the face and then just ignore you. So complaints have been filed about that, and basically all we say is you just have to acknowledge it if the request is made orally. Now, where we get more involved is if the request is made in writing. And so if they mail the request in, they fax it in, they email it in, well, then you have 7 days to respond to that. 7 days, all calendar days, it doesn't say business days. And so basically, again, the only thing you have to do is within 7 days of receiving their request is say, hey, Joe, got your request, we're working on it. We'll have that to you in a reasonable period of time, signed, Betty Davis, Marion County Clerk's Office. Now, one of the interesting things with inmate complaints is sometimes inmate mail is a little bit slower, and so they will send out a request on May 1st. The clerk's office won't get it to May 12th, and they'll respond to it on May 18th. And the inmate will be like, they violated the Access to Public Records Act because they didn't respond in 7 days. Well, it's 7 days of the receipt of the request from the requester, not 7 days from the time they drop it in the mail. So just keep that in mind. Also, with that 7 days, you don't actually have to they don't have to have something in writing within 7 days. You just have to put it in the mail, I guess, or fax it or email it within 7 days. And so that would be the requirements there. A tricky one that does come up, and this would come up if an agency requires the requester to fill out a form when they're making a request, or if somebody comes in and just hand delivers a written request. And so in that situation, what you're required to do is you're required to respond in 24 hours, but since it's a written request, you have to respond in writing. And so just keep that in mind. And typically the media likes to do it in this fashion, not that there's anything wrong with it, but if they hand deliver a written request, you have to respond in writing within 24 hours. And so those would be the requirements there. Now going forward from that, obviously the next question is, well, how long do we have to respond? And the answer is you have a reasonable period of time. And so it's a completely subjective standard. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about one of the more common complaints we receive is I filed a public records request. It's been 3 weeks. I haven't heard back from them besides their acknowledgement. I think that's too long. Here's the things that we're going to look at. Number one, how many records are responsive to the request? Are we talking about something that's like 3 or 4 pages? Or are we talking something about 3,000 or 4,000 pages? Number two, where are the records located? Is it something that's located, in a filing cabinet in your office or on your computer? Can you just print that record out? Or is it something you have to go to off-site storage to, look through 50 banker's boxes before you know that you have all records that are responsive? Other things that we take into consideration, it's common sense. Let's say, for example, you have 3 people working in your office, and let's say 2 of them are on vacation that week. And usually you respond to all public records requests within, 10 or 15 business days. But here, you had a couple employees out. Well, let us know that. That's something we'll take into consideration. If you have employees that are out sick, or, if you are an election board and the request comes right in the heart of, the election season, well, those are all things that are going to have an effect on why, it took this long to provide the records. And so in opinions that we've issued, I've said before that 4.5 months is not an unreasonable amount of time to provide 2,000 records. At the same time, I've said it was unreasonable for an agency to wait 2.5 weeks to provide one record that was responsive to the request. And so, just basic common sense. One of the things we always say is, keep the lines of communication open, especially for larger requests. I think the average, from my association with the Access to Public Records Act, and our office gets public records requests too. Nothing I know to the extent that you guys receive them, but wow, I completely lost my train of thought there. I'm just on road up here. You got the machine, the computer finally stopped. So when you receive the public records request, wow, you have to respond to it. I'm sure I'll come back and think of the point, but just use common sense. So for example, if I know it's going to be like 1,000 pages I'm giving out, I don't have to wait till I retrieve all the records and go through all the records before I give you all 1,000 pages. Let's say for the first week, I have some time, and I say that every Friday between 1 and 3, we take care of all our public records requests. And that first week, we go through 250 pages, and I say, he can have all of these. Well, I can tell you, hey, we have 250 pages that are responsive to your request. Feel free to come by and pay for those and pick those up when you want. This does a couple things. Number one, it lets the person know that you're taking their request seriously and that you're working on it and that you're not just ignoring it. What the law also does not say is that a person gets instant access to records. So one of my favorite complaints to get is I went into the clerk's office, I made the request, they were all just sitting there. I know they weren't working, and they didn't get up and get me the record. And so our response there is, well, the law doesn't say you get instant access. As long as they're responding to you in time, acknowledging your request, then, they're complying with the law. You don't, how I infer it is you have a bunch of balls that you're juggling, all the requirements that you do as auditors. One of those balls that you have to juggle is public records requests. And it's not the only request. What the law says is, agencies, we acknowledge that, you're busy and you have a lot of things that you have to do. You just need to realize that one of your duties is responding to these requests. It's not your only function, but you just need to make sure it's one of the functions that you were, doing diligently. And so that is the way I kind of break it down as far as that. And so if you think, question? Well, first of all, you'd have to create them. And so let's say, I know a lot of times, the meeting will be held and the clerk or the secretary or whatever will audio record the minutes, and she'll just be take some shorthand just to kind of remind her. And you would basically, number one, you'd have to actually create the minutes. And so let's say you've already created them. I mean, if a complaint is ever filed, the onus is always on the agency to say, this is why it took this long. And so I guess for if it was just a normal work week for you and I don't want to give an exact hard deadline, but if it's just one document and it's not, excuse me, since it was recently created, since I'm assuming it's going to be on a Microsoft Word or some other computer program and all you'd have to do is print it out, 2 weeks is probably, but generally we're not seeing, when we see complaints filed regarding timeliness, it's the larger requests or it's requests that are just beyond the norm that require a lot of redaction. Usually minutes, there's not a lot of redacting going on, if any. And so I would say a couple weeks at the most. Again, if you had some employees out, that would be something we would take into consideration. And if you kind of communicated that to the person saying, hey, I know, we're a little bit slower here in providing this, but I just want to let you know we have 2 employees out. Keep those lines of communication open so they, again, don't feel like they're being ignored. And if they feel they're ignored, the more typical they are going to be to file a public records request, or I'm sorry, a complaint with our office. And so one of the big things I'll look at in those complaints that say you guys took, or the agency took so long, is was there communication between the two? You have your first communication that, within 7 days I have to acknowledge the request, but I don't know, if a month goes by and there's nothing going back and forth between the two, it's not bad just to give the guy or the lady just a status update, say, hey, we're working on it. Just wanted to let you know that we're not ignoring your request. Just kind of a civility, kind of due diligence type thing, just to prevent future headaches. There is no requirement of that, but the more communication I see, the more likely I'm going to say that the agency was reasonable because they let you know kind of where they were in the process throughout the time. And usually this, like I said, is only going to apply to your larger request, not something that you're going to be able to get out in a couple of days. So, I can.
We had a lawsuit last year with one of our employees with the county, and as auditor, I was communicating email back and forth with our county attorney, and then a taxpayer came in and requested public records with the emails, and our attorney said that the client-attorney relationship overrules the access to
Public
records,
Act.
so that I did not have to give them the emails that I had with the attorney on that issue. Is that correct? Your
attorney is correct. We're going to talk about emails in a second, but that goes back to the point where if you're going to deny a request, you have to cite to a specific citation that says that these records are confidential. And there's an Indiana code site that says, that attorney-client communication is privileged. Now, it's one of those weird, so it's literally considered confidential, but it's at the discretion of the agency. So the attorney could never release those emails if he got a request of his own. But the agency, I guess if they wanted to for some reason, could say, okay, we're going to break this disclosure requirement and we're going to give these out. But agencies aren't doing that. If it's attorney-client communication, and then you have protection from the law and you don't have to release the records. Now, you just have to make sure you're issuing the proper denial. And we'll get to that in a second. But when you issue a denial, like I've been droning on about, you have to provide the specific statutory site, and you have to give the name and title of the person making the denial. And so For your request there, I believe it's like Indiana Code 3617B, something like that. You would just have to say that citation code gives us, declares that the records that you're requesting are confidential, and we are going to deny your request for the records pursuant to the request you submitted on May 1st. Sincerely, Joe Hoage, Public Access Counselor. That's all you'd have to do, and you would be completely correct. And so, again, with your denials, you need a specific statutory code, and you need to provide the name, the title of the person issuing the denial if the denial is applicable. You can't just say HIPAA makes those private, or you can't say we don't have to give those to you. You obviously know we can't, or basically you need to provide the statutory code. Or and this does happen from time to time, the agency will just ignore the request. You can't really do that either, and so ignoring it is kind of, in a way, according to the law, denying it as well. And so in that situation, if you just ignore a request, then you're not complying with the law because you're not telling the person why you're not providing the record. And so don't ignore public records requests. So again, you have to give the citation code. And one interesting thing about HIPAA that people don't realize, that I didn't realize, that HIPAA does not apply to every single agency. I know that the research that I've done, for the most part, it does not apply to law enforcement. And so I'm fairly certain, like, the auditor would not be able to cite to HIPAA in regards to the release of information. You have to be a covered entity as defined by HIPAA. And so if you are or have made a records request denial pursuant to HIPAA, it may be possible. I don't declare this to be my biggest strength of the law is the HIPAA law, but you want to make sure if you're denying for HIPAA that actually you are a covered entity pursuant to HIPAA. And so in Indiana, there's a number of places throughout the law that say certain things are confidential. Common sense stuff is like Social Security numbers. So, for example, if I got a records request for Dear Joe Hoage, I want all records of the Public Access Counselor's office that provide your Social Security number. I can't just respond, Dear John, you're an idiot. I have to say, Dear John, thank you for receiving your request. Pursuant to Indiana Code 514.34A12, Social Security numbers are confidential. I can't provide those to you at this time. That would be your proper response. Other things that are in there, trade secrets, patient medical records created by a provider, different things like that. One thing to keep in mind, there's confidential stuff that you can't give out that you're required not to give out, and there's discretionary stuff. The confidential stuff is littered throughout the Indiana Code. Like in certain spots in the APRA, it's going to provide you that trade secrets are confidential. Court records declared confidential by the Supreme Court are confidential. But for example, I got a request the other day, and I came to find out that veterinary medical records are confidential. Now, I didn't find that in APRA. I had to go out and search in the animal health control issue section of the Indiana Code. And so in that code, basically, it says that veterinary medical records are considered confidential. And so for some reason, if you had records that were responsive to the request, you would have to cite to that Indiana Code and deny the request. So sometimes people say, well, I looked in the Access to Public Records Act. It didn't say anything there was confidential, so I can get the record. And I'll say, no, you want it, because you are aware of the records in your office, and I'm sure that are confidential, and they're the records you're dealing with every day. Off the top of my head, typically, I'm not going to know what records of the auditor that are always going to be that are confidential. The same way I'm not going to know the same way for the Indiana Gaming Commission and different things like that. And so if something's confidential, it's just not necessarily going to be in this section of the law. It's going to be littered throughout the law. So that's something that you want to keep in mind as well. So when we go into the discretionary exceptions, those are situations where you're typically only going to find those exceptions in the Access to Public Records Act. And these are situations where commonly arises to a lot of the disputes that we have and a lot of the formal complaints that are filed. And so, for example, public employees' personnel file information. The law states that there's certain information that you have to give out if somebody makes a request that's for information that's kept in this employee's personnel file. If anything else beyond that, it's your discretion on whether to give that out or not. For example, I get a record request. Joe Hoage, I want to know how much money you made in 2011. Salary information is something that's public information. I'd have to give that to them. I have to say, last year, the state of Indiana paid me X amount of dollars. The same way would be if they said, Joe Hoage, I want to know your business address, I want to know your business telephone number, I want to know your work experience, I want to know your educational background, different things like that. Now, let's say they ask me for let's say my performance review evaluations are kept in my personnel file. That is something there that you have discretion whether to give out or not. And so in my office, I have one employee, and I know the last time I gave a personnel evaluation, I keep all that stuff in her personnel file. So if somebody requests that from me, I could deny that, and I would deny that, but I'd have to cite to say B8 of Section 514.3.4 says that, you know, I have discretion on whether to give that out or not, and I'm not going to give that to you. And so basically the legislator said, agencies, there's going to be situations where we're going to leave that up to you whether or not you want to disclose that or not. And as long as that record falls into that group, well, then you have discretion on whether to give that out or not. And so same thing would be, and it doesn't, I'm sure, come up too often for the auditor's office, are investigatory records of a law enforcement agency. Any record created or compiled by a law enforcement agency in the investigation of a crime is discretionary. It doesn't matter who makes the request. So, for example, if an inmate makes, let's say, I robbed the casino here today, and I got thrown in jail, and I got sentenced to 5 years in prison, and 2 years into my sentence, I said, well, I want to get all those records from the sheriff's office that put me here. And I would make the request of the sheriff, let's say, I want all the records that you used, all the witness statements, all the DNA, all the videotapes. I want you to send all that to me. I can almost guarantee that the sheriff's response is going to be, thank you for the request, pursuant to Indiana Code 514.3.4b1. Those are considered investigatory records because they were compiled or created during the investigation of a commission of a crime, and we're going to exercise our discretion not to provide that to you. It doesn't matter if I'm the actual defendant or I'm a member of the media or I'm just, you know, some concerned citizen that's going around making random public records requests of different agencies. You know, nobody gets greater access over another when it comes to the records, and so there the sheriff has discretion. Now, when family members or, you know, friends of inmates will call me and say, well, that's not really fair because I want to get those records to, like, do an appeal or something like that, I'll say two things. Number one, have you made the request there of the lawyer that represented your family member or whoever? You know, they have those records. They're required to provide those to you, but that is not something that you would have. That's not a public records request. That is you making a request of a private attorney. And the same situation would be the APRA is completely separate and distinct from litigation. For example, there's rules of discovery that are involved and, you know, during a criminal case. And, you know, so, you know, when I got arrested for robbing the local prosecutor is required to turn over to my attorney all the records they're going to use to throw me in the slammer. Now, I can make my request of through discovery, I can make requests of the other side, but I can't just come in off the street or 5 years later and say, I want those records pursuant to the Access to Public Records Act, because there the agency is going to have discretion. And so one of the things I always give out if somebody becomes frustrated about not receiving a record or, you know, anything of that nature, I'll say, think of the other agencies or think of other people that actually have those records and see if you can actually get those records from them. And a lot of times, going back to the investigatory records, making a request of the attorney will usually get the records produced, and, you know, everybody will be happy so the person can proceed on with their appeal or whatever, you know, other reason they want. We spoke about it before. Attorney-client privilege is considered confidential. An attorney work product. If you have an attorney working on behalf of your agency and he's working in anticipation of litigation, that work product that he's producing is going to be considered, you know, attorney work product, and it's not confidential, it's considered discretionary. Now, you're probably not going to get many times where an attorney is going to voluntarily turn over his work product, and so people sometimes say, well, it's really confidential because they're never going to get it to me. Well, the law says it's discretionary, and so if they want to, they can. Deliberative materials is another big one. There's a couple of key parts of this. It's records that are intra-agency or interagency, that are advisory or deliberative, that are expressions of opinion or speculative of nature, that are communicated for the purpose of a decision-making. So my bread and butter example here is, let's say I wrote a memo to the governor and I said, tomorrow is Tuesday. I think you should wear a blue jacket on Tuesday because it makes you look more professional and it helps your chances of becoming reelected in the next term. If somebody made a records request of that, my first statement there, tomorrow was Tuesday, well, that's a factual statement. There's nothing opinionated about that. There's nothing speculative. I'd have to give them that. But the second sentence where I'm saying, I think you should wear a blue suit jacket because it makes you look more professional and help you get reelected, well, that's speculative, and that's, you know, was communicated for the purposes of a decision-making because he had to decide what kind of suit jacket to wear that next day. And so there, they could deny this, you could, if somebody made a request for that simple record, you would have to, your first sentence there, you'd have to provide. The second sentence, if you wanted to give that to them, if you did not want to give that to them, you can mark that out and just say, pursuant to Indiana Code 514.3.4b6, that's deliberative material, and we don't have to provide it to you at this time. So that's something, because basically what the legislature has said and what the courts have said is that sometimes that public agencies and public employees and public officials have to have frank discussions about how they're going to handle things. And, you know, these kind of deliberative materials, you know, if this exception wasn't there, it might chill their expression, and they will not be able to say so freely, I think we should build this bridge, or I think this is a complete waste of time to, you know, add another wing to the school. And so they allow, in these situations, you know, those sort of materials to be not provided at the discretion of the agency. And so that's something that you'll want to keep in mind. Last two things regarding to denials, we touched on it before. If you got one record and half of it has stuff that you have to give out and the other half has stuff that you either don't want to give out or you can't give out, you have to redact the bottom part and provide the top part. You can't just say, no, there's one sentence on that record that has non-disclosable material, and so we don't have to give you anything. A lot of times what will come up, and this would be the only time, one of the only times you don't have to specifically cite to a statutory code in denying a request, is simply if you don't have a record that's responsive to their request. So we get this all the time where I made a records request of the clerk's office and they provided that they didn't have any records that are responsive to my request. Well, if you don't have any records that they're looking for, you don't have to create a record in response to a request. And so there, you just need to tell them that, you know, we received your request, we don't have any records that are responsive to it, and, you know, provide your name and your title. And so let's say I get a request at the auditor's office and I know that what the person is requesting is not something that I have, but I know that the clerk has it. You don't have any obligation to go over to the clerk's office, get those records for them, you know, parse through all those and then provide them to the person. Simply what the law says is all you have to do is let them know you don't have any records. You know, if it's not too much trouble, it'd probably be nice to say, by the way, I think the records that you're seeking are at the clerk's office. Just, you know, make your request there, and that's fine. But again, there's no requirement, but I guess we would highly encourage that. And so not having a record that's responsive doesn't mean that you're violating the law. You just need to let them know. And so keep that in mind. Email is one of the last big things we'll talk about. It's a two-step process when you get a public records request. Number one, is it a public record? And number two, do I have to disclose it? So I'll use myself as an example again. I have two email accounts. I have a work email account, joehoag@icpr.in.gov, and I have a personal email account through Yahoo. Any record that I'm sending and receiving through my work account is going to be considered a public record. Now, that freaks everybody out. Whether or not I have to disclose it or not is a separate exception. So going back to the example here, the auditor here was having email communication back and forth between her and her attorney regarding an issue that affected the office. And so, number one, is that a public record? Yes, it is. Number two, do the exceptions of the law still apply to email requests? Yes, they do. And so there, it was attorney-client communication, and they could deny the request. Now, the way this comes up most often is that the common example is, I'll just use a gentleman to kind of throw us under the bus. A gentleman will start having email communications on a personal nature with another employee, another person who's not his wife. There'll be things in there that'll be completely embarrassing to that person. The wife will then come in and make a public records request for her husband's email account. There's nothing in the public access law that's going to save the husband there. So it's funny, I know it is. It happens once a month. I get that call once a month. And so you got to keep in mind, number one, keep your emails accounts separate. Don't use your personal account for your work, and don't use your work for your personal account. If you are one of those counties that doesn't have email system, if it was me, I would create a Joe Hoag at fairwaycounty.com clerk's office through Yahoo, at yahoo.com, but I would not use my personal account for my work account at all. And so just keep, if you can retain anything here today, remember that. And so if I received a public, I've, given this presentation for so long, if I get a public records request tomorrow for my email, it'd be like no sweat. I mean, I'm still going to go through, and there might be certain things that I'm either can't give you or, have discretion on not to give you, but I know that there's nothing in there that's embarrassing to me. And so, keep those things separate as far as, your personal communications and your work communications. And as far as how long you're required to keep certain records, well, that's based on the retention schedule of your county. And I know soon the Indiana Commission on Public Records is going to be updating their county retention schedule as far as what is required of emails. For example, I think we could all agree, I get a little blurb in my work email account every afternoon from the Indianapolis Star telling me what are the top news stories of the day. Now, there's a distinct difference between that and, let's say, me getting an email from you saying, hey, I've got this public records request, what do I do here? And so what's likely going to happen is that retention policy is going to state that, Joe, for those Indianapolis Star emails, for those Walmart bonus offer emails or different things like that, you're not going to be required to keep those. But if it's anything in relation to your work, you're probably going to be required to keep it for at least, I would say, 3 years, if not more. But you just want to keep in mind that, you have to keep emails. You just can't delete emails when you leave the office. And so if you're going to delete an email, you want to make sure that you know what your retention schedule says on how long you have to keep those records. And so that is something you definitely want to keep in mind. I guess an interesting story is from Texas. This is how I guess your personal email could bleed over, is that and all public access laws are kind of the same, but sometimes they're a little bit different. And so in Texas, there was a councilwoman, she got elected, and on her business cards, she provided not her work email account, but her personal email account. And so over the course of the next couple of years, she handed these business cards out, and eventually a member of the media made a public records request for those records. Her response was, that's my personal email account. I'm not going to give those to you. I don't have to. They're not public records. The court said differently. They said, since you held this out to be your work email address and you told people to contact you as the councilwoman at that address, well, then you've opened yourself up to making your personal email account also a work email account. And so again, she would have available to her all the exceptions that would be applicable, but there might be some emails that she might not want to give out that are in there that she would have to give out. Again, that just hammers home the story of don't mix your personal and your work emails. Well, I guess that's a good question. I would want to know, I would want my IT department to know, I would say, do you know what our applicable retention schedule is for these email records? If they're saying no, then I say, I think that you should contact the Indiana Commission on Public Records and ask them what records from our email we need to be keeping, because you all have a responsibility as public employees and public officials to, make sure that the records that you have aren't deleted, destroyed, mutilated, things of that nature. And so the email is the same as any written account. And so if you're intentionally emailing, deleting records, you're probably violating the law. And so if they were saying you have to delete these, I would say, are you sure? Have you contacted somebody at the Indiana Commission on Public Records? They have a clerk, she used to be the clerk, county clerk, and now she's worked for the Commission on Public Records for a number of years, and so she's in charge. Her name is Bev Steyer, actually. Great employee, great lady, and she will give you kind of the rundown of what you're required to keep and what you're not required to keep. So that would be that. Copy fees, you're allowed to charge copies. I'm sure you all know this. If you're a state agency, it's 10 cents for black and white, 25 cents for color. If you're a county agency or a local agency, generally it's whatever your county retention schedule, or I'm sorry, your county fee schedule says. Generally that's going to be 10 cents or 25 cents. You can't make money off the Access to Public Records Act, so like if it takes you 14 hours to search and provide and go through all the records, the only thing you're going to be able to charge the person making the request for are the actual paper copies, so you want to keep that in mind. If they make a request for electronic records, and let's say, for example, they want the meeting minutes emailed to them, and you have the email minutes like in a Word document, and you can attach it to an email, and you have email account through your county, it's probably just good measure there just to email it to them. It's going to be, most likely, I would assume that's going to be easier for you, and you'll be able to, get those requests out in a quicker fashion. So let's say, for example, they wanted everything saved to a disk. You could charge them for the disk. You basically still couldn't charge them for the time it actually took to, put all those records together. You can require them to pay in advance. I would highly encourage that you do, because that's the one time you're going to be able to guarantee that you're going to get the payment for the records. And there is no requirement. There is no informa pauperis. So an inmate making the request can't say, I don't have, or anybody can't make a request and say, please waive the fees for the records since I don't have the funds to pay for them. There's nothing in the law that says that you have to do that. And so they can't have their fees waived pursuant to the APRA, where they might be able to if they made a request via the court and discovery and things like that. I'm going to talk briefly about I know everybody probably has this on their minds as far as the new fining regulations that go in on July 1st. And so basically, this is only going to be reserved for the less than 1% of the employees of the state of Indiana that intentionally defy what the law says and don't give the record out in response to the request, and don't, I guess, have the meeting open to the public. Basically, it's intentional defiance. It's not like, oh, I wasn't aware, I'm sorry, I didn't know that I couldn't deny that request, or different things like that. And so here's what would have to happen. I would have to come to you and make a request. You would have to deny my request. I would then have to go to the public access counselor. I would have to go to the public access counselor, and the public access counselor would have to say, you know, Fairway County Clerk's Office, you had no business denying that request. You violated the Access to Public Records Act when you didn't give that record out. Fairway County gets that, my advisory opinion back, and they read it, but they just ignore it, and they're saying, we're still not going to give you that record. We don't care what the public access counselor says. At that point, the person would have to go and file a lawsuit in court. And not only would he have to file the lawsuit against the Fairway County Clerk's Office, he would have to file the complaint against the person that was responsible for the denial. Remember, in your denials, you have to put the name and the title of the person that issued the denial. And so we're already a couple good steps into this. And so there, the judge would have to say, you know, Fairway County, you really should have given him these records. There's nothing here that's applicable. And actually, the judge there can actually go through the records that the person requested just to kind of make sure and double check that the agency, you know, knows what they're doing. The judge would have to say, you are wrong, Fairway County. You should have given those records. Produce those records to them. And you also, you know, Jane Doe, who's the clerk there, you're going to have to pay a fine of up to $100. Now, if Jane had relied on the opinion of her attorney, their county attorney, or the attorney general, then the judge would not be able to fine her. So basically, you're talking about a person who ignores the public access counselor, who ignores the law, who ignores their own attorney, who ignores the attorney general, and says, you know, to heck with all those people, I'm still not going to give you those records, or I'm still not going to let you in, and that's that. I don't care. I'll wait for my, you know, decision from the judge. That's the type of person that we're talking about. And so I'm assuming that everybody in this room can safely say that you're not going to fall into that situation. And so I don't think really you have anything to worry about. I do think actually it's good that the law is there. Number one, just to make, you know, there are going to be situations where I'm sure there might be some bad faith. Although I've never run into them, it's not inconceivable that that wouldn't happen. And secondly, if it provides any incentive for agencies to actually make sure that they're responding to the public records request in a good period of time and that they're doing everything the law says, then great. I'm glad it's on the books. But I don't think Indiana is suddenly going to be overcome with, you know, these extra funds from the fining that judges are going to give out based on this provision of the law. Because, for example, if we'll talk about, you know, as far as, you know, what the public access counselor, when I issue an advisory opinion, regardless, prior to this law, these are only non-binding advisory opinions. You know, you don't have to agree with what I say. You don't have to do whatever I said that thinks should have been done. But if a person has to file a lawsuit, then, irrespective of the fining, if they came to the public access counselor first, no matter what I said, and the judge says, you know, agency, you should have had this meeting open to the public, or you should have given him these records, you might have to pay for the attorney's fees for the person that made the request and then filed the lawsuit with the judge. And so a lot of times what will happen, and they're called non-binding advisory opinions, but even when the agency gets something that says, agency, you violated the open door law because you didn't provide notice within 48 hours. They might not agree with me, but sometimes they'll say, well, what's the worst of two evils? We go back and redo the meeting and we provide, you know, the proper notice, or do we just risk it and say, well, if he's going to sue, fine, we feel comfortable in that. So a lot of times the agencies will just go ahead and comply. And so I have yet to find an opinion where I've said that, agency, you clearly made a mistake here. You need to go back and rectify that, where the agency hasn't done it. Because we are neutral. I mean, like I said, my job is not to guarantee that the records get out. My job is, in a sense, to make sure that the law is being followed and that if a denial is issued, that it's a proper denial. And so basically that's the law where it's at. Now, also, if the person made a completely frivolous lawsuit against the county could then ask the judge for attorney's fees from the plaintiff. That hardly ever happens. I think maybe it's happened one time in 12 years. So we'll open it up to questions here, but I just wanted to close with a couple things. This is our contact information here. You know, as I said, public access requests are one of the balls that you're juggling in the air. You should just pretend that I'm like a little employee of your office that sits in the closet, and anytime you have a question, you should be able to go to that closet, open up and say, hey, Joe, what am I supposed to do here? Or, you know, what are we supposed to do there? You know, use me. You know, the General Assembly has said agencies are going to have to comply with these laws, but if you need help, use this person here. And so that's what we're here for. And so there are no silly questions. There are no stupid questions. Feel free to just call. If you just want that peace of mind to be able to say that I checked with the public access counselor, he thinks I was fine, and so at least you'll have that going forward. And so, again, there are no questions that are too silly. Please feel free to call us whenever question you have. And so, at this point, anybody has any questions, feel free. If not, I mean, I'll stay. If you don't want to ask it in front of everybody, I'll stick around up here. If you want to come up and ask, that's fine too.